Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt and this is another podcast for The Diplomat. And with me today is Chris Wolf. Chris is a veteran correspondent who spent only a few weeks in Afghanistan many years ago, but the results of that period is his latest book, Bumbling Through the Hindu Kush, a memoir of fear and kindness in Afghanistan. Chris, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
Tell me about the book. I mean, this is back in the early 90s when Afghanistan was a very different place, but when we look at it now, it hasn't changed that much.
Yes, still very chaotic. It was a very different situation back then. The Russians had just left. The communists, regime that they'd left behind was still in power, and the Islamic rebels, which were still the friends of the West, were trying to kick them out. And I was working for the BBC World Service at the time, and was at that point in my career where I could try the life of a foreign correspondent. And my mate was stationed in Kabul, so I went to go visit him, and thinking we would enjoy the life of a correspondent, I said, well, let's see if we can see more of the country than just the capital. And I was rather under the impression that we would fly from one safely held government-controlled city to another, but instead we hitched a ride with a humanitarian aid convoy and blundered right into the war.
Right. Why Afghanistan? I understand your friend was there, but to be a foreign correspondent, you don't have to go to Afghanistan.
Well, I was curious, for sure. And I thought I knew what I was doing. I had been a infantry soldier in the British Territorial Army,
Sure.
So the reserves force. So I thought I understood, weapons and technology and different kinds of threats. And I was very well informed. I was one of those geeky kids who would read everything they could about foreign places. So I knew pretty much what was going on in Afghanistan very well. So I thought I could manage the threats that we would face, but really all that peacetime military training and reading cannot prepare you for the real thing, as you probably well know.
Yeah, it's a tough country. Tell me something. The Russians, I remember when I was in Afghanistan, I kind of half anticipated to come across, fear and loathing, the propaganda, everything that went along with the Cold War, and particularly with the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Do you think they were that bad?
The Russians?
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you, I don't know if you ever drove up the Salang Tunnel at that time, or in the early 90s, how early in the 90s you were there.
Yep.
But I was there in 1991, which was approximately 12 years after the Soviets invaded. And the Salang Tunnel is this key pass through the Hindu Kush Mountains. And the Mujahideen quite rightly understood that it was key strategic value to the Soviets and their regime there, as all the supplies needed, fuel, food, ammunition, came from the Soviet Union, from the north, over the border, and then had to cross the Hindu Kush Mountains to reach Kabul in the southern half of the country. So key strategic pass. The Mujahideen understood that and started attacking the supply convoys from the get-go. And so, understanding Chairman Mao's maxim that the guerrilla is a fish swimming in water, the Soviets just decided to drain the river. They depopulated the entire valley by force, and it was a chilling... We've all read the phrase laid waste in military history books, but to see it having taken place for a 100-mile stretch, 50 miles either side of this key tunnel, every village laid waste, not even a goat or a dog or anything like that to be seen, only soldiers trying to protect this key strategic pass. So every one of those houses would have contained a tragedy, a family displaced or potentially people killed and driven overseas. A third of the population fled in terror from the entire country. And then on top of that, you've got the secret police from 1978, the first communist coup, rounding up and torturing and killing their suspected opponents by the tens of thousands, to the extent that they shocked the HUD, the secret police, shocked even their KGB handlers for their cruelty and capriciousness. So I'm not going to pass a judgment. I'll let your listeners make your own mind up from that.
I think the answer is yes. What I was kind of referring to is that by the time I landed there 8 years later, the country was desperately poor, famine. There wasn't much working in the country. The war was ongoing. Everybody was fatigued. But one of the few areas that was productive was that road from Sarobi through to Jalalabad and onto the Khyber Pass, where the Russians had done extensive work on irrigation, and it was one of the few areas where you could get food from. And
well,
it was
that's an interesting cost-benefit analysis, isn't it?
Yeah.
They where they impose order, there can be some structural improvements, just like there were in during the U.S. occupation. There was a lot of investment and positive construction of infrastructure, schools, irrigation, and so on and so forth. But where that clashes with the popular will, I guess, if that's the way you want to characterize it, then, you know, it's okay, great, we've got roads, but we've got the... it reminds me of the Monty Python
I
and
thought
the
you would say that.
Life of Brian. You know, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Exactly, the roads.
You know, you've got your roads and your aqueducts, but where's the freedom that, or at least the freedom to practice their faith and follow their culture in the way that they understand it? You know, it's going to clash with that, you know, economic, superficial overview.
Sure. Now, in your travels, you were guided by Abdullah, who I did know quite well there for a period, and also you did meet Ahmad Shah Massoud, who, as a Tajik warlord, was often considered a moderate, I guess. He controlled the northeast and beyond the tunnel. How did you find them? And in particular, how did you find Massoud?
Well, it's an interesting question. Looking back, I was talking with my companion, the correspondent who was stationed there, Chris Bowers, just in the course of researching the book. And we were considering the possibility that we were actually set up by the United Nations, which was a big player back in the early 90s, probably at the height of its diplomatic influence. And we know that they were trying to get an answer from Massoud for his for their peace plan, which would have brought a peaceful transition. That was the hope, from the communist regime to a more multi-party system. And Massoud responded by saying, well, if you want an answer, you're going to have to come to me. And so they set up this very rare humanitarian aid convoy, and it was just a couple of trucks, so it wasn't a big one. So I was thinking, well, if the situation is so dire where these supplies are needed, why are they taking only a couple of trucks worth of material? But anyway, so as you may know, the Afghan custom is, if you want to see the big man in town, you go to his area and present your compliments, let it be known that you're there and open to seeing him, and maybe he'll see you, maybe he won't. And so we went into his into the lion's den, if you were, if he was the lion of the Panjshir, up in the north in a place called Talakan, and basically we're just going about town doing regular business of reporting on the town's social, economic conditions and such. And then word came down that Abdullah was here. He started guiding us around. He was in charge of the local reconstruction committee at the time and was showing us how well the city was run. You know, the Mujahideen were trying to make the case that they were fit to run a country, so they made a very good effort to show us, at least, that they could do a good job of running this region. And then it was through Abdullah that we made the connection, and then ultimately were taken up into the mountains to meet Massoud at one of his Mujahideen rebel training bases in the Farqar Valley on the north side of the Hindu Kush. And that was how we saw him.
How did you find him? I didn't mean how did you find him. And what sort of welcoming committee did he send out? Was he gracious?
Well,
was he...
obviously he was. No, I mean, Abdullah, I didn't really realize at the time, was, in a sense, Massoud's right hand man. I thought somehow there was a separation of military and political systems in the Mujahideen. I was kind of brought up on the Western model, so I didn't really understand how closely they were working together. So Abdullah was the man. He brought us to the camp at night, and we just crashed in a barracks built into a cave. And obviously, Massoud was public enemy number one at the time, so there was a constant danger of assassination and airstrike not from the government, and then, of course, the danger of attack from his rivals in other Mujahideen groups. So security was top notch, and basically they wouldn't tell us if he was going to be in the vicinity or not, and then suddenly they woke us up in the night and said, "It's time." And Abdullah brought us into this other building and for Massoud's grand entry. And he came in, yes, a very imposing figure with a big traditional Tajik blanket coat, which made his shoulders look huge. So he's much more impressive looking than he may have been without it. And, of course, that famous jaunty pakul cap on his head off at an angle to cover his damaged ear. But still, a very imposing presence. Okay. He knew how to make a good impression, that's for sure.
Of course, Massoud was aligned with Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was recognised by the UN as president of Afghanistan throughout the 1990s. And once the Taliban came into power, they wanted to take that away, and they wanted that UN recognition for themselves. They never got it, and in particular with the events, obviously, that happened after 9/11, now they want it back again. Do you think, given the events of the last 6-7 months, that the Taliban should be given recognition as a legitimate head of state in Afghanistan?
Well, that's a very tough question, because what's at stake, all the things that you mentioned from the time that you were there, famine, disorder, they're all looming again. And does it behoove the Western international community to try and head that off with practical help to the people? Because the consequence of non-recognition could be that you cut off aid and support programs that are helping people. So on the one hand, it seems wrong to recognize a regime that came to power by force of arms. On the other hand, failure could have severe humanitarian consequences. So maybe there's something in the middle where there can be a deal to work with the regime to prevent, in particular, another famine. And then, on the other hand, stop short of actual recognition. That seems to be like a practical step at the moment, just to avoid any tragedy, especially as we're heading into the winter.
Indeed, and also going full circle, it would appear the Russians might be setting up just that kind of deal. So we're kind of back to where we started at, even beyond that.
Well, in a practical sense, Afghanistan is much more in Moscow's backyard than the Washington's. Perhaps even, looking back at the map of the USSR, it was more in Moscow's backyard than, say, Cuba is in Washington's backyard. So you can understand that they have an interest and concern, especially with any efforts to spread or fan the flames of Islamic militancy within the borders of the former Soviet Union as well.
Right. How did you feel when you saw the American withdrawal? I'm presuming you watched on television like the rest of us.
It was extremely tough to bear, because in my analysis, which is shared by some other experts I've been talking to in the defense analysis community here in the States, it didn't need to be like this. It did not need to go down in this particular way. And, the reasons for that are partly for the US to take responsibility for, and partly for the Afghan government itself, which I can get into. But the emotional reaction was just appalling, because you and I know that, even if there's not a great deal of fighting, the chaos and the criminal activity that runs alongside any transition is just appalling for the people in those areas.
Indeed.
Where power's changing hands and scores are being settled, and in the way that people are brutalized in that way and robbed and so on.
Right, and you're also seeing the rise of ISIS again, and they're in Afghanistan, and they make the Taliban look I was going to say a tad nicer, not the right words, but yeah, no, I mean,
The lesser of two evils.
yeah, perhaps. I mean, I remember many years ago, Jean-Claude Chapon, who was a famous old French war correspondent, he always ranked the Khmer Rouge number one, Tamil Tigers number two, primarily because they just didn't care. The Taliban, however, were number three, and the reason why he didn't rank them higher was because that desire by the Taliban to get international recognition kind of kept them back a little bit from the atrocities that may have been committed had they cared less. And
Right.
then along came ISIS, and they just don't care.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And then one of the big factors in the situation they're going forward is that all those centrifugal forces that make it hard for any government in Afghanistan to effectively control the whole country, just starting with the geography and then the mosaic-like structure of society there, where the local identities are often more important than the national identity. All those forces are, and then of course the poverty, are going to be working against any central government. And you're going to find, as the Taliban finds it hard to pay its foot soldiers, those guys are just going to be looking for a new boss. And it's going to be easy for them to find, either with ISIS or with any personalities or factions that split off from the government for whatever personal or ideological reason. So it's going to be a challenging time ahead for sure.
I think that's a very good point. When you look at the Americans spending, I think, $80 billion thereabouts on rebuilding an Afghan army, the various warlords that have always been opposed to the Taliban, and they all simply evaporated as they came marching into Kabul. And you know, the old line about you can't own an Afghan, you can only rent one, and it was about $30 a month, I think, back in the 1990s. And they do switch sides, and their loyalties can be acquired by an opposing force because they have money, let alone more money, but they can pay the bills.
Exactly, and I think I in my brief time in Afghanistan, it was very apparent that what really wins wars is this prestige and momentum. If it looks like you're winning, then you're going to win, because loyalty, as you say, is malleable, and people who know they're going to be left there, don't want to die. So if they can cut a deal while they can, they will, if they think it's going to help them, get through the next transition. So I think that was the big original sin from both the Trump and the Biden administrations, was to destroy the prestige of the Kabul government and say, yeah, we don't think you got a prayer. They never said it in those words, but it certainly was the impression that everybody received. When you probably saw the tweets from those Afghan colonels in the early summer saying, we've been betrayed and abandoned. Why should we die for this kind of thing? And it's not like they don't have the will to fight. I mean, they've been dying by the tens of thousands since they took the lead in the fight in 2014. Something like 66,000 Afghan security personnel have been killed in the fighting up to then. So that's like 10, 12,000 a year from that tiny population. And that's a terrific sacrifice. And so it's kind of insulting to hear from the US president that, they won't fight. No, they felt like they'd been abandoned. So what was the point? It was pretty tough to watch that.
Indeed, Shades of Saigon in 1975 has often been the comparison. Back to the book. What are your favourite stories from your own memoir?
Well, it's easier to recall the kindness than the fear. In the subtitle, A Memoir of Fear and Kindness in Afghanistan. It was pretty tough to write the fearful bits, obviously, because I had to dredge up how it was felt to be in particularly tricky situations. But then I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the kindness of strangers. So that's an incredible thing to grasp onto, where, for example, I'm not going to give away too much in the book by saying there was one night we were caught in literal no man's land with shells and heavy machine guns firing overhead both directions. And not a pleasant place to be. But we were taken in by this farmer and his family and given shelter and food until it was safe to travel again. And he wouldn't take any payment or anything of that nature, of course, when it was time to go, because it was just the nature of the people, the nature of the culture, and these individuals that obviously they're putting themselves at risk of retaliation because sheltering foreigners could be perceived as a problem by either side. And it was just that kind of thing that, warms the cockles of the heart to know that people can be, even in a country so brutalized by war, that most people retain their humanity and compassion. So that's the kind of thing that I like to remember. And then, try and obviously forget all the bits where we were at risk.
It's a difficult thing to write about. For those who've experienced wars, I think they kind of understand that uncle who served in World War II or Vietnam and sat in a corner and never spoke about it again.
Right. Exactly. And I like I said, as you know, my experience there was quite brief.
Yep.
And so I like to say and be humble, I only had a taste of war, a taste of fear, but it still took a long time to deal with it. So it just gives you an impression for people who do come from those countries or who have served there or worked there, how hard it can be to move on, as you say.
Indeed. And you have moved on. You spent, 30 years with the BBC up until 2020.
Exactly. So most of that I did, after getting the wit scared out of me, steer my career mostly toward working with live news production for radio. And then for 20 years or so with the U.S. public radio system and working on an international news program. So kept my hand in on the international news circuit and put my experiences to good use. They put me in charge of correspondent safety. And so I made sure everyone that I sent out into the world had everything that I didn't, starting with training, first aid kits, communications, and backup.
It all came a bit late. I was under the impression that a lot of it only arrived once the insurance companies realised that, we could be in a permanent state of war for some time to come. And if we're going to insure these media companies for the correspondence they have in the fields, they're going to have to buckle under and start shelling out for better training, better equipment. All that.
And there was a couple of cock-ups in the 90s in the Balkans from various international news organizations, that unnecessary deaths. And obviously lawyers noticed that as well. So there's another fear of legal restitution as well, which is unfortunate. But, hopefully there was a moral awakening as well. I wasn't part of management at that time, but
I'd like to think
one would hope.
Yeah, one would hope. Tell me about the history guy.
So yes, for I did get into management for a while, as I was saying, but then situation changed in 2014 or 2013, and I just it was nicely maneuvered out of management. I said, yeah, but you can get more time on air. So I took on this persona as the history guy for the US public radio program, The World, where I would basically talk with the host and explain what the origins of a particular current issue were. For example, in that year, we started doing a lot of stuff on, for example, Crimea and Ukraine and the Russian interests in Sevastopol or something like that. So that was an interesting time. So that was the last 7 years on air, talking about all these interesting things like previous waves of immigration in the US and how each wave had encountered hostility. Obviously, the immigration was this hot button issue through most of the 2010s, if we can call them that. And so it was a fun gig.
Okay, and what next? You've got one book out, planning on any more, and would you go back to Afghanistan?
It's funny. I have a lot of interest. The book has sparked a lot of interest among immigrants in the United States from the former Soviet Union. Some people have been brought to tears, I've been told, because it touches them very personally. A lot of the families of my generation, and There's was one guy in particular who's been saying, "Oh, I've got connections. We can get you back there. It'll be a great story." And I'm thinking, "No, I think I'm done.
You've had enough.
I had enough close shaves without wanting to go back." But for me, I got 6 or 7 projects cooking. The challenge is to pick one, and I also have a day job running a voiceover company as well, so doing interesting things like corporate training on cybersecurity, the voices for films of that nature. So it's keeping me busy and out of mischief.
And that's not a bad thing. And while we're at it, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it's funny you say that. My daughter asked me to write it down for posterity. I'm getting older. I hope she's not putting me in the grave just yet, but before the memories start to fade. So that was really useful to have her in mind as I was writing it, because so many of these books that come out of Afghanistan are inaccessible because, the author's trying to impress academics and think tank people, whereas I just wanted to share my stories, so I kept my daughter in mind. So the book's been written with the assumption that whoever picks it up knows nothing about Afghanistan or war or even journalism, so that everyone can come along on the journey, hopefully, and enjoy my stories and understand just enough to know who's shooting at who around me.
Indeed. And on that note, Chris Wolf, author of Bumbling Through the Hindu Kush, a memoir of fear and kindness in Afghanistan. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Luke.